Well, thanks for joining everyone today. We're really excited to present the role of an intranet in amplifying corporate culture. This is a couple topics, both intranets and culture, that are near and dear to my heart. Just quickly introduce ourselves here. I'm Brian Edwards. I'm the Director of Products and Services here at Habanero. But what my title doesn't indicate is the 20 plus years I've spent in the intranet space. I started the collaboration practice here at Habanero, which was really based on building intranets. And before working at Habanero, I was an intranet manager at a big Fortune 500 bank in the US, something I share with you, Christina.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Christina. I am the product manager for our Go intranet, and I've been also working in the space around people and technology for nearly 15 years. I've been at Habanero for about five now, just most recently in the product management role. Previous to that, I've worked in companies like Google and BC Hydro and BC Government Caucus, and we both share the role of intranet manager.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess on the topic of Go or product Go, I mean, you and I have spent lots of time thinking about how, Go as an intranet product or how intranets in general really can help be vehicles to amplify culture within organizations or help organizations discern their culture more appropriately. So a little bit about why that is. You can think of Go as our digital way of helping organizations bring life to work. We have a really passionate team here that wants to help organizations be better workplaces. And so much of the work we do, whether it's in the culture space or the intranet space, is really about this idea of, making people's work lives better. And that really starts with us. We are a great place to work, and we've been in one of Canada's top workplaces for the last 9 years. We are currently number one, which is for companies under 100 people, which is amazing.
Very exciting.
It's really exciting, actually, and have been number one 4 of those 9 years. So this is not just a badge we wear in order to attract people and something we want to do for ourselves, but we feel it's really an important piece of learning for us to be doing the work that it takes to create a great organization and be able to take those learnings into our client organizations. Yeah, so on the topic of this webinar, you and I have lived this life before.
Yes, the life of an intranet manager.
Yeah, I mean, kind of this game of whack-a-mole.
So many requests coming from so many different people in so many places of the organization and trying to make sense of it.
Totally. I think all these inputs that you get into an intranet, what the potential for an intranet to go to is just this. I mean, I guess you can say it's like a hub of just content, and a lot of intranets out there are like that. Probably my first intranet was kind of more that.
It's hard also not to resist the order-taking mindset when you're in that role. There's so many different people coming at you with all these different requests, and it's hard to prioritize in a meaningful way when every part of the organization has their urgent needs, and trying to line it up with something more important is not always a linear path.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the genesis of this presentation, that there is a higher order cause for intranet managers out there. I think it almost requires a moment just to reflect on the role of an intranet manager and the role of communications in organizations. Like I think, intranets used to be hubs of content because that was what people expected of communications. They were just gateways and hubs for content. But I think the role of an intranet manager is dramatically changing. We see them a lot more involved in, helping amplify the culture in the organization and taking on these transformational cultural shifts that start at the executive level, but really kind of work themselves into the organizations. I think if we had a thesis for this presentation, it would be, intranet managers should be thinking of their intranet as a way to amplify those cultural needs, those transformational needs across everything, even as they evaluate those individual tools that people request.
Yeah, it's kind of like that ultimate state of an intranet. If we think about the old maturity models for intranets, you kind of have that. Get some communications out there, store some documents, maybe introduce two-way communication, start to do some integration. But this is really the thing that should be the guiding star for it all.
Yeah, cool. So this presentation is about that. And we're going to start a little bit about recapping some of our recent webinars and conversations around culture and why we think that it's kind of an important lens for intranet managers. We'll talk about the role an intranet could play to amplify culture. And some of the things that intranet managers need to do in order to kind of connect the dots between the culture and the choices they're making on their intranet. We'll actually show you our intranet and give you a little bit of a tour behind
the curtains.
Yeah, behind the curtains. And then show you some other intranets that we've built and that we think can tell the story of how those organizations are helping their culture come to life. And then help you out with some next steps, like help you think about what you could do if you're interested in using your intranet to better represent and amplify your culture, or maybe perhaps you're just starting your intranet journey in general and you're wondering what needs to be in place for these two things to happen properly. Mm-hmm. So let's start here with this idea of why culture, this idea that the intranet is not just a content organization tool. I think there's a couple lenses you can take when you think about the role an intranet could play in culture. And one lens is thinking about it from that employee journey perspective. And this is actually a perspective a lot of our customers really lean into when you think about how people experience their organization. So what you're looking at here is this idea of literally the employee journey from when they're hired to kind of the future journey of perhaps, finding their way in the organization, hitting their stride, and perhaps looking for, that growth opportunity in their next career. And if you think of that journey, all of these areas along this journey are chances for an employee to connect with the capabilities and tools and the experiences they have with their intranet. Especially if you think about, what it's like to be an employee on that first day or that first week. There's a lot of potential for an intranet to play an amazing role in really shaping the employee's understanding of the culture.
And that first impression of an organization really comes out in those first few days.
Exactly. I mean, whether or not the organization plans that or not, their intranet is a reflection of that culture. We were just talking about how, all of those cultures that let their intranet sort of slip and don't update their intranets. I mean, that's
representation of the culture.
Yeah, it's a representation.
It's one of the things that I love the most when I'm working on consulting projects is getting to see that intranet for the first time, because, I'm sure as an intranet manager, you really didn't get to see that many intranets yourself. But when you're in the consulting kind of headspace, you get to see all these different intranets. Really exciting.
Yeah.
Kind of getting a look at the culture of an organization in a snapshot.
My favorite thing is when we get feedback from people about the intranets that we've built, and some customer sends us a note that comes from a new employee that says, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe how great your intranet is here. This really helped me be productive in my job really quickly." And I love those kind of comments.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So this journey is one lens of thinking about, well, what are all those organizational touch points where someone might need to access and get information that sits on their intranet, whether it be the kind of cultural stories and the storytelling that helps them connect with purpose and be more purpose driven, or it's the literal tools to get their job done. I mean, this is one way of thinking about where is your intranet really amplifying those cultural moments, and where is it falling down and creating these negative interactions in negative places where people, make decisions about your culture.
Or if you're trying to shift your culture, where are the opportunities to try to amplify it more?
Yeah, that's a great segue to this second lens, which is, not just thinking about it, your intranet as a way of reflecting the employee journey, but maybe also thinking about it as a way of thinking about what the organizational journey is in this moment. What's the change or transformation or the need that sits within the organization that you want to use the intranet as a way to amplify those that thinking, those beliefs, those behaviors. So it could be anything from helping organizations better connect to the purpose of the organization. There's a lot of talk these days, and we've done some webinars around this topic, around helping organizations and employees in organizations be more purpose-driven, and the benefits of being more purpose-driven. Or it could be really specific, like a lot of the organizations we work with that have field workers often talk about the criticality of this, creating a culture of safety, and having an intranet serve that purpose in really special ways. I think is an opportunity area for intranet managers.
I think for internet managers too, they often hear the digital transformation and how they can support a digital transformation in an organization. With companies we deal with, there's often a merger and acquisition that happens when you bring two different cultures together. And that's really a pivotal moment for an internet to play a role.
Yeah, and I think on that topic of digital transformation, one of the things I think that people forget or they fail to do is they use a term like digital transformation and they never really get to the brass tacks of like what does it look like to be digitally transformed? Like is it a productivity thing? Is it something about the way people collaborate and communicate with each other? So
Totally.
I think it's an important part of the journey to really understand what your needs are before you actually can create an intranet that reflects that. One other way of thinking about culture and organizations, and this is just something that we've been sharing in previous webinars, and I thought it was worthwhile to repeat here, is this idea of there are those observable aspects of culture, and we can call those the kind of the obvious things that people see. Maybe it's the stories that people are telling. Maybe it's some espoused values that the organization has.
The jargon.
The jargon.
The language.
Those are kind of obvious ones. And I think if you think about intranets of old, it in those non-hubs where it was more than just a content gateway, I think internet managers have seen it as a way to tell those stories and tell those amplify the storytelling around purpose and values. But I think what's interesting about the potential of intranet is that it actually can support in that stuff that's under the waterline, those hidden beliefs and behaviors. And one way is by actually just helping the organization understand, well, what are the beliefs and behaviors that sit out there by how people are interacting with the information and the content and the comments that they put on those pages. And then two, like there are ways to build in tools and capabilities that actually help the organization amplify those beliefs and behaviors that you're looking.
And then you can measure it, right? Like that's so exciting. Like you can actually observe and watch behavior in action.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not always the case when you're thinking about what's happening in your organization. I kind of feel the internet in the sort of iceberg model is like right in the waterline of the observable and the unobservable. And you kind of have to squint hard to sometimes see things that are not easy just view. So something like IA, how you've organized your internet, that's something you can take a look at and represents your culture, but you have to sort of pay attention for those things to come to life. A lot of organizations we deal with shift their IA to a very organizational structure. So based on how they've organized their actual company instead of topic or task based, it represents kind of how they think
the lens
about
of their company. Yeah,
yeah,
how they think
exactly.
about the organization. And we usually know those don't succeed very well in terms of working in all parts of the organization, as people who work in the field don't know what the company structure looks like.
That's one, yeah, sometimes. So it sounds kind of daunting to think about making a cultural impact with your intranet, but there are some kind of basic steps you can take to think about how you can create that impact through your intranet. We usually like to come into an organization and start by, kind of understanding the culture, talking to people, spending some time with the business stakeholders. We usually start with something called a business orientation. This really gives us a foundation to understand what are your goals, what are your objectives, is there a big change coming into your organization that you want to drive, and then sitting down with people. And I think any intranet manager can do this any day of the week. As a product manager, I'm constantly talking to customers, and I think as an intranet manager, you need to constantly be talking to employees about their experiences. And as you start to talk to more and more people in your organization, you see these trends and you start to gather some data. Things like analytics can help with this too. So you can begin to see some opportunities on how you want to shift, change, amplify, enhance, support the things that are meaningful for your organization.
Yeah, I love that in that exercise. What we'll often see is where there's organizational friction between like an espoused value, let's say like transparency, and then in the interviews you hear people talking about all the places where they're hoarding information or not sharing it because they're afraid to. And so it's a great activity to really understand the task at hand for really creating a more transparent culture by using that input that comes from the bottom up.
Absolutely. And really understanding the people that work in your organization. Something that we'll do is understand the archetypes or the personas of the different types of employees that exist. Like you talked about where they are in the sort of their employee journey, whether they're onboarding, but you can also look at slicing and dicing the sort of perspective on people through the roles that they play, the offices that they work in, the type of work that they're doing. And this really helps you sort of shape which ways you can position content and how you can support their experiences.
What I've love about this exercise is when you go out, especially when you have like a global organization and you go out and you actually understand perhaps the experience of employees that sit in other regions. I think one of the big insights you often get from that is how vastly different people experience the organization. And and I think with a lot of organizations these days, trying to be more like one organization, I think that's a really common trend we're seeing in terms of culture right now, is to try and bring together these different facets and different business units or locations into a kind of an idea of one org. I think you really get to understand the task at hand of how to be successful at that.
Absolutely. And I really feel it's about building empathy, right? Like just understanding people's perspectives, their pains, the things that light them up. And that really just helps you be better at delivering something that's meaningful for them.
So I think what's interesting about doing that research and also looking to what the organizational goals for is that you can't do everything.
Yeah.
You can't possibly implement every cultural need or attribute in the organization. So one of the things that I love that I think is a really valuable part of all of our intranet projects is this idea of focusing on the governing principles. And this is a list of governing principles that's so incredibly small that I know no one looking at this right now could possibly read, but I've pulled out a few. Typically what we see in projects is, as a result of both the organizational goals and what we hear from those interviews and the empathy that we've built in the organization, we tend to draw those down to 4 or 5 key guiding principles that are going to help decide, how are we going to make decisions? Really. Yeah, some grounding principles around how we're going to make decisions around features and functions. What are the things that we want to be imbued across this entire intranet? So things like that we are one organization, like I talked about, or perhaps it's a cultural change that you're trying to make around empowering innovation, perhaps because you don't feel the organization is really strong at that. One we commonly see is this idea of being really member and community centric or customer centric. That often comes up as a guiding principle. And so it's defining these and refining them and coming down to a short select list of a few. That's really an important exercise, because these really then shape how you think about everything that you do on an intranet, the personality it has, and what features and functions are there, and even how you structure content.
Exactly. And it really lends well to prioritizing things in like the format of a roadmap. So this example, you can see a roadmap that we've included principles that directly align with kind of these components or epics that drive the change we're trying to make and the type of functionality we'll be rolling out. And that kind of grounding of principles also helps communicate with leadership and other people in the organization the shift that you're making with your intranet, and can be a really powerful communications tool as well as a planning tool for you.
So being a great place to work here at Habanero, one of the first things people often ask us is, okay, you're a great place to work. What's your intranet like? Especially if we're in an intranet conversation with them. So, peeking behind the curtain here, I thought we just kind of walk you through our intranet and kind of think of it as sort of an anatomy of how we represent our culture at Habanero and some of the choices that we make around that. And maybe we start with the colors and the brand.
Yeah, the brand. I think the brand is an important thing to call out, because on first glance, it doesn't match the Habanero brand that probably many of our customers and clients would associate with Habanero. We've actually purposefully left on H the Go brand. And why we've done this is because we're constantly iterating on Go, and we want to apply the most out-of-the-box version of that on Habanero's intranet, so we can kind of drink our own champagne and experience what it's like to have the features that our customers would be getting before they even get them. And this allows us to be a lot more innovative, a lot more experimental, and that kind of builds that culture at Habanero as well. Like, we are an experimental type of organization, and we sort of thrive off doing new things and learning things as we go along, and it builds that into the people that work here.
Neat cultural story that relates to that. So 4 years ago on our employee survey, and when we asked people, did they feel Habanero was an innovative place? That was actually one of our lower scoring scores across our employee survey. And one of the things we did in those 4 years was start to do things like this. You use the term drinking our own champagne. I think the rest of the world usually says things like eat our own dog food. Maybe that gives you a little sense of our culture here. But since we've done this is actually not a sore spot anymore in our employee survey. It's great. It's helped reinforce us as an innovative culture, as it's kind of showing people how we're being innovative on the fly.
Absolutely. And like, as you go through this intranet, like, we have high prominence of imagery around people in Habanero, and these are real photos of real people who are really making an impact. You can see things like the balanced scorecard, and the balanced scorecard is something we do monthly, and it represents how Habanero is transparent around our financials with everyone in our organization, and that's really a powerful message that we send to the rest of the company.
Yeah, a little bit on just the transparency of that. So our balanced scorecard, we actually share everything from our revenue to our expenses and the bottom line profit that we made in every month to everyone within the organization. So they always have a view of where we're at and how we're performing, and it's just our a cultural commitment to being transparent and always helping people be part of the journey with us. So it's a big part of who we are.
Absolutely. And then you see like Stephen Fitzgerald, who is our president and CEO, right at the top of the page with his article around bringing life to work. And this was not planted.
Yeah, no, I know. It's just so convenient. But yeah. it actually is a series of videos where he talks about Habanero's purpose, our values. We're just in the process of launching a new 3-year set of goals. So this is a forum and a place where he gets to talk about those.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. So if we go back to the homepage, we can kind of scroll down, and some of the other things, you're starting to see new Habs, but the next thing that comes up is Hab Gigs. And Hab Gigs, I think, represents part of the culture at Habanero that we're cultivating and nurturing around picking up work that's available in the organization, kind of playing with that gig economy. Like, there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen at Habanero, and we're a really helpful organization that wants to put their hand up, but people aren't always comfortable trying something that they haven't done before. Maybe they won't be selected by somebody else in the company if they don't even realize that person might be interested in doing that type of work. So by putting gigs out there, you get this kind of cross-pollination of skills and abilities and locations. So instead of just asking somebody in the Vancouver office to help you with something, now you have this kind of broader reach of somebody in the Toronto office or somebody in the Calgary office. So it's been pretty exciting.
Another place that we really amplify our culture at Habanero is by exposing a lot of those Yammer conversations that we're having. So I guess you could say a compliment or another part of our intranet is Yammer. It's a place where a lot of that on the ground active conversation goes, but we know not everyone necessarily knows how or what happens in Yammer all the time, because it's if you are a company that's using it, it can often be quite noisy. So this is a way that we highlight some of those really important things that are coming up on Yammer. I call it #Yammer feed. And so if we feel it's important enough to highlight and bring onto this homepage, the person who writes the article will add that. And so here you'll see Ben, who, echoing that transparency we just talked about the other day, he actually was posting about T3 planning while T3 planning was occurring. So we're in the meeting having planning sessions and then exposing to the company, what we're talking about and what some of the insights we have from that process are. So it's, again, a peek behind the curtain for people at the organization and being transparent about that process. And then we have, of course, showcased on this page also this idea of recognition. This is really important for our company and being a company that really values people, as we've talked about earlier. This idea of having a forum for people to notice when other people do something that's amazing, and being able to talk about that, and recognize them in a public way.
Yeah, we do it all the time. And then the last item on the page that you'll see is just a photo gallery, like more about people at Habanero and highlighting the kinds of people that work here and how we're connected.
Yeah, so that's just a super brief, quick walkthrough of our homepage, and sort of some of the ways that it represents the habanero culture. And now we'll get a chance to take a look at what some of our clients are doing around that, and some of the neat stories about how they've taken the stuff that's emerged in as important for their journey, and how that shows up on their intranets.
Before we jump into examples, I do want to address the topic of name. I feel like when it comes to naming your intranet and just thinking about the personality of your intranet, it does tie back to that cultural moment. And there's been some great names in our history here at Habanero.
Yeah, we've seen lots of great names. Like I love one of the mining organizations we've worked with in the past, Goldcorp. Now Newmont Goldcorp, they named their intranet Conveyor, which I think is really cool, representing something that's helping bring the gold to the employees.
Another one I love is Sleep Number's intranet. It's called The Wink. Representing like their love of sleep and the value of sleep and health to people that they work with and the customers they serve. So I just think it's a charming, lovely name.
Yeah, another one of my favorites here is a good segue is Barton Mallow, one of our first client stories that we'll share. Barton Mallow is a construction organization. They have about 2,000 employees. They have 16 offices across 10 different states in North America, and 148 job sites often, or at the time I last spoke with them. I'm sure that's a fluctuating number. 52% of their workforce is deskless, which I just thought was an interesting detail to them too. So they're not just battling creating a culture within a corporate structure, but also how do we reach all those deskless workers that work on the construction sites and the people that are in those jobs building their amazing buildings. They built buildings like Ford Field and the Daytona Speedway and some other amazing structural icons inside of North America. And so just a little bit about their organization. We
got to give the name. Dirt.
Yeah, Dirt. Yeah, it's so right. The way we segue to here, I think it's an awesome name. It just really represents their culture. They have a really people-oriented culture that they strive to be casual and open and really friendly with through their intranet. And it's something that I've always appreciated, that in some ways we have a connection with them on. It's just how people-oriented and how important people are to their organization. And so as we walk through their intranet, just giving you a sense of what's there, they really built their intranet with this idea of connection, helping people be able to feel like they were connected to the organization and enrich those connections through storytelling and being able to share what was going on across the organization. If we move down the page, they've got, just like we do, that Yammer feed so they can surface those stories that are happening in the organization. And one of the ones that I think is curious or interesting is this corporate metrics section, which you could think of as being dry, but this is for them really around creating alignment, this idea of really purpose-driven as an organization and helping everyone align around that purpose, which I think is a really neat, strategic intent behind having something like a corporate metrics section on the intranet. And then at the bottom of here, of course, they like Habanero, they have that connection to what's going on in the organization at a more personal level, where people in the organization can submit a photo and they share photos across all their different job sites and locations. And this is actually one of the most used places that people go for content.
Photos, people story. I think those are all really powerful tools when it comes to like giving examples of how your culture is coming to life. Like storytelling is always a powerful mechanism. And when you see it happen in an organization on their intranet, it really begins to shape how people operate.
So I think one of the ways that I think that's really clever and different is that they wanted to have their culture come out was this idea of through their content. So what we're looking at here is the People Essentials page. So this is the kind of page on an intranet that gathers all that HR and essential, who am I in this organization information. And so you'll notice here they have this section about the new employee. And I think one of the things they focused on is the content that they had on these sections. So for example, here it says, hey, you got the job. Congratulations. Now dig into your new hire checklist and see how you can get up to speed fast. And it's subtle, but it's this tone that they're creating in the organization. You can imagine what a new employee's experience is like, hitting this page and understanding this as a representation of what the culture is like. I think it's an amazing way to reinforce that friendly, people-oriented culture that they have inside their organization.
It just goes back to the whole idea of creating that personality for your intranet and thinking it through like all the way down to every piece of content.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes we have this conversation around an intranet is almost like a person that people meet in the organization. That person is either someone you like or not someone that you don't like. And so, and they also, it sets the tone. It uses the language that you're hoping people adapt and on all those pieces of your culture that you really want them to echo with their own, how they show up in the organization.
Yeah, and they even do it on their newsletter. Like their
also a cool name,
yeah.
The Dig. Yeah.
They're one of the best at naming. Okay, so moving into our next example, we're pulling up some the intranet for Provincial Health Services Authority, or PHSA. And PHSA is health authority in British Columbia. It's a large organization. There's 20,000 employees, last I heard. And they have many different agencies, including BC Children's and Women's and LM Labs. It's a pretty
cancer agency and
cancer
the ambulatory
agency.
services.
Oh my gosh, they do everything.
Yeah,
it seems
so for people who don't know who they are, they sort of represent a shared services for health across all of British Columbia, and so we have hospitals in British Columbia, but they also share services.
Some of them, parts of it.
Yeah, like women's health. Mm-hmm. And so all these employees work for their unique agencies, but they all report to this organization, Provincial Health Services Authority.
Yeah, so there's an interesting combination of PHSA where it comes to physical locations, but then also these agencies. And when we worked with them, their goal, or one of the big driving guiding principles that we were striving for, was this idea of one PHSA. They were working right at that time with 8 different intranets representing different parts of the organization, and they wanted to bring those pieces together to help push and support the one PHSA approach.
And I think this is, as we talked about in this presentation, this is kind of a important one for a lot of global organizations right now, this idea of being, one organization. And I've actually seen this go too far. Like we have one client that they were so keen on being one organization that on their intranet, they were publishing only the corporate information stories and none of those local stories in their organization.
Yeah.
And so much so that people actually weren't going to the stories because they didn't feel they were relevant for them. So I think
it's almost like smushing too much into one box.
Yeah.
And you lose the value that you get from segmenting them apart. But I don't think it has to be that way. And I feel like PHSA was one of those examples where we were very thoughtful in how things were coming together. So here's POD. PHSA On Demand, also a very loved name in their organization. And POD was trying to represent both that one PHSA vision, but also represent parts of their organization, both regionally and through roles. So on the homepage, you'll start to see things like My Workplace. And My Workplace, the background is actually a picture of the BC Women's Hospital, and everything in that panel is really related to people at that location. So when people log into their computer, they'll actually see information that's related to their location. This is a point of pride. People who work in these different locations, they really care about the work that they do, the place that they work, the people that they know at that location. They also want tools and tips that support them at their location.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly that place where you're striking that delicate balance between that one PHSA, but also representing the local flavor in each of these, in their case, health authorities. So when we did the research in their organization, there was a lot of passion around how people related to those authorities, and the idea that we might be pulling it all together in one experience. We got lots of feedback about how that was not who they identified with. It wasn't. It was daunting to them to think that we might be taking away something that they had a lot of pride in. And so this is one of those ways that we wanted to reflect that local culture and the locality of people's experiences, and also still but drive to that singular experience.
And it actually improved their experience, because a lot of the times these sort of local links weren't available in such a prominent way.
And one thing we didn't point out on this page, but you'll notice that under our news and upcoming events, like we actually also target those specifically to those agencies. And so it's not just the panel and that My Workplace and the My Workplace content, but it's also, as people first hit pod, they are given an option to opt in to the different agencies that they want to keep on top of. And so, yes, there's some global news that everyone sees, but there's also a way to connect to the local storytelling that's happening in each of those agencies. And this is a great
events.
way. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because there's nothing more annoying than going to a page that's super unrelevant to you.
Absolutely. And not just that, they also have staff that don't just stay in one location. So it couldn't just be about the location. It also had to respect that people were mobile and worked in different locations, so they could change and adapt their settings to support what they wanted to see, what mattered to them. So I was just going to look at the menu. We called this the favorites menu for them. It was something that resonated. But what we did here was we created not only the sort of company-wide links, but we also separated out links that were specific to an agency. This supported them finding the tools that were really meaningful for the jobs that they were doing. And this was high importance, because there were very specific links that enabled like nurses and staff in these different agencies to get to the tools that they were needing most frequently. And those were not the same agency to agency.
Yeah, I actually think what's really interesting, if we were to scroll down this page just a little, it's the kudos feature in their organization. And this feature, I think, is really interesting because we have seen companies do kudos locally, just like the news and the My Workplace. In their case, they actually chose to do kudos across the entire organization. It was one of those ways they wanted to bring recognition to life across all of PHSA and not think of themselves as just in these silos agencies. So it's again being thoughtful around these individual pieces and parts that make up your intranet. And I think it's amazing that they spent that much time thinking about those little tiny details. And this taking this one level deeper, it's maybe doesn't feel like it's super culturally wound when we get this low, but they have policies and procedures and job areas where you can go look at job descriptions, and all of those also have this facet of the agency. So making it super easy for the person to just find this stuff that's really useful for them personally. It's this, again, that really respect for the regional experiences and those local cultures.
And I think kind of walking the line too with organizing content or policies or just by topic or task. We can kind of go too far with that as well. You sometimes need to take a look at the organizational structure and respect it. When you're working with IA, it has to be the right kind of blend, and this is how we were able to do it for PHSA.
So another story I think that's really interesting around culture and how an intranet is used to amplify culture is the story of how we worked with WestJet. They had this really interesting event. It was actually a really kind of groundbreaking moment for them. Their CEO, Greg Soretsky, used this moment to talk about what is WestJet going to look like in the next 20 years. And they called it Ignite 2020. A really important moment to reflect. They were experiencing a lot of competition in the internet market. Numbers were down at WestJet, and this was a moment to really align people around their next mission in the organization. And so on the back of that event, they turned to Habanero to kind of look at, well, what could we do to help people connect with this journey that we're on and be part of the conversation, so that we're not just telling them what we're going to do, but we also are creating some dialogue around that. And so we worked with them to try and think about, well, what's the sort of minimum viable product, the most the best thing that we could build without focusing on everything. And they created this area called the hub, which normally I don't like the word the hub as a name for an intranet, but for WestJet, I actually think it's appropriate and
There's
a
some
clever
really
name.
appropriate use cases for the hub.
Yeah, no, it's I would say the number one intranet name for our clients. So on theirs, they just decided to focus on the stories, which is really compelling. This was actually not the sole intranet. They had another intranet that focused on the content and information around things like people and HR. And this was really just a storytelling tool for the organization. The big thing for WestJet was they wanted it to reach all of those field workers, or in their case, the flight attendants and the pilots and the people that were on the road, so that they could talk to them and tell them stories too. And so it was a forum for both to post the stories, but you'll notice there on every story, which is not uncommon, they have those likes and comments. And this was something that they were really encouraging. In their case, they actually have those conversations on Yammer, and they integrate those with the stories here on their intranet.
But it's surprising how many intranets that we still come across that don't have likes or comments.
It is.
Like it's not universal. The idea of two-way conversations isn't just something that every organizational culture can tolerate or embraces.
Yeah, and frankly, it is a reflection of your culture, whether you have them or not.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think it's something we get into really early in almost all of our conversations with clients, and sometimes I think intranet managers in the communications department are pushing the envelope inside of their organization for that greater transparency and dialogue they're trying to create with their employees.
And like the when and how and if you remove a comment, or what your guidelines are around commenting, I think it's another reflection of your culture, because it can be quite a sticky conversation to be had when the comment can be, a little bit harsh on the direction of an organization. But what better way to have that conversation with your employees and out in the open versus in the media?
So segueing terribly from that, I think there's this really interesting and fun tool at the bottom of their intranet. And so here we have this place where they're communicating their 2020 vision, or their next 20-year vision. And at the bottom of the page, they're reinforcing something that I think we've all come to know about WestJet. If you've ever flown on any of their planes, they love to tell jokes at either the beginning or the end, or all through the flight. And so this is a chance for the flight attendants or whoever to share those jokes and have a joke of the week. I think it's just a neat little peek into the personality of their organization.
Yeah, as a cultural gem.
So lastly, I would like to share a story that I'm kind of had to go to the Wayback Machine on this one. This was actually an intranet that we built quite a few years ago, actually. But I think it really tells the story about transformation interestingly, or really well. ICBC is the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia. There are about 5,000 employees. They're here in BC. And they are an organization that runs automobile insurance for all of BC customers. They run 3 different businesses. They actually do the automobile insurance. They run the claims on that insurance, and they also do all of the driver's licensing for British Columbia. But you can imagine, because they run these different business units, how hard it is to stitch together that customer journey and the customer experience around, ICBC. And they actually were doing a poor job of it. They had this thing they called the barbecue score. The barbecue score was like, you're standing over a barbecue having hamburger and brewski, and you ask the other person, hey, what do you think about ICBC? And whatever that person says is the barbecue score. And they were feeling they were scoring pretty low on the barbecue score. So they created a transformation program that was solely focused on serving customers and the customer experience. And so when we went in there to go rebuild their intranet, I think there's some really interesting things that we did to kind of help amplify that service ethic and the service culture that they were trying to make. And so I'll just kind of talk through some of those. So you'll see in that main navigation there, they have this area called Serving Customers. And this was a brand new content area. Like, this content previously was scattered amongst a bunch of different departments, like you had mentioned earlier, this departmental metaphor. And here we have these customer scenarios of serving customers. So, working on getting your driver's license, getting insured, having to deal with the claims and those different touch points.
It's a big shift in mindset. And we see this in a lot of organizations trying to really shift to a much more customer-oriented way of working. And also it just like representing your content that way just shifts the people's perspective, your employees' perspective.
Yeah,
it makes them think differently.
It was, and what was really interesting about this exercise, and I think this is one of those things that when you're in the project you have to figure out is, this isn't necessarily the mental model people had of the organization. So there was a lot of risk, and there was a lot of handholding for departments to work their way into organizing content in this way, which is a testament to kind of how important this was as a cultural agenda for them. Yeah. The other piece that I thought I'd point out that I thought was another interesting feature or capability that they put on their intranet around this was you'll notice here, this is an example of a news article, but in the upper right hand side there, they have a poll that's actually specifically asking the question, does this news article help you understand what we're trying to do to impact the customer perception of ICBC?
It's a direct relationship.
Yeah. So right there in the news article, they're getting that real world feedback around whether or not even the stories that they tell are helping people understand how they're changing the customer perception. So it's really amazing feedback for someone that's out there creating news to be able to understand the efficacy of their work in the
Absolutely. And even if the employee doesn't actually respond to it, just seeing it there and reinforcing that messaging all the time, it sends a clear message to the people who are, going through the content. I think that's the last example. We might have to skip over some over here at the end here.
Yeah, we have got lots of customer examples, like sitting down prepping for this. I mean, the challenge is like, which stories do we tell? And culling all the content of some of the really cool ways our customers are driving content. So
we might actually have to do another one if there's interest. Like it'd be helpful to know if this topic is interesting for people. So just as we close out, kind of how to get started or what would be your next steps. Honestly, if you haven't spent much time in the culture space or you're just kind of getting to the idea that there is a higher level order to your intranet other than, the day-to-day content and trying to drive some of your intranet metrics, start with some of the webinars and the content that we have. I think this is really great foundation for ramping up.
Yeah, so if you go to our website here, this is our stories page, and a few that I just wanted to call out there, like successful approaches to organizational change, understanding and intentionally changing your corporate culture. There's an insight there about being a transparent organization. We talked about that, about how Habanero does that, and that article actually shares even more about how we do it. And then this webinar about starting a successful purpose journey with your organization. These are awesome starting points for really anchoring around the cultural agenda. Like, what are you trying to do in your organization? What is the change that you seek? What is that next leg of that journey for your company? And kind of you do that work first before moving into, okay, and how can an intranet reflect that work? Now, I'll just say, if you have already viewed these and you've done the culture work and you actually are now ready for your intranet journey, awesome. There's lots of ways you can get going on that too. We're both of us are really happy to take any of your calls or questions around starting your intranet journey. But for us, it's going to start with that work that we talked about up front, which is that building empathy in your organization, understanding what's there, and starting to create that roadmap.
And this is one small plug for Go, but even in a Go project, we always do that work. Like, I think that's something that is really important to us, and why we've built it into a in-a-box product is because we really care about those deeper meanings behind intranets and folding it into everything that we do, whether it be intranet projects, our product, or collaboration, websites, really building in the deeper meaning and the purpose behind the work that we're doing to enable organizations to really, live their purpose.
Yeah, reflect their culture. I mean, we would not want to give up helping organizations name their internet, right? That's one of the best parts. the name reveal.
Yeah, love it.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. We're glad you were able to be part of this conversation about intranets and culture today.